Well, hello there. Merry Christmas. You know, there are a lot of great gifts you can give a kid for Christmas. A new bicycle, a puppy, a little brother. But is there anything quite like getting a brand new Sega Genesis game with those beautiful clamshell cases ripping off the cellophane to release that new cartridge smell? I remember it like it was just 34 years ago. Yes, sirree. The year was 1989, and I got the gift of a lifetime, the brand new Sega Genesis. It came with a 3-button controller, Altered Beast, and a mild case of childhood obesity. Altered Beast is easily beaten within roughly 15 minutes, especially when played with a friend. Childhood obesity, on the other hand, well, that took years and years to beat. Which was the better experience? You know, childhood obesity had its advantages, particularly in the world of comedy, but I'd still rather deal with Altered Beast. It's 2 players, has massive, beautiful sprite work, and of course, it famously allows you to transform not just into a werewolf, but a dragon, a bear, and a tiger. Oh my! When I first opened up Altered Beast, my thought was, this looks way cooler than Mario Brothers. My second thought was, what in the heck is Altered Beast? Now, I was 7 years old, but seeing this game in action in 1989, after playing hours of 8-bit Nintendo at a friend's house, well, this was a true revelation. But then when that transformation screen came on, and I saw my man turn into a werewolf, that's when I dunked in my pants. A full-blown 2-pointer. Nowadays, whippersnappers all around like to talk about how boring or lame Altered Beast is compared to these contemporary games people are playing. Well, I reckon that's just fine. You go on and enjoy that. But on that day during the Christmas of 1989, to me and mine, well, Altered Beast felt like the greatest game ever made. That is until I opened up my next present and I saw this. The greatest video game box art ever made. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. This was painted by Yuji Kaida, a great illustrator from Japan, most famous for designing the movie posters for Godzilla and some high-profile anime such as Gundam and Patlabor. This, however, was no anime. Rather, this was the box art for Ghouls and Ghosts. And I think it's Yuji Kaida's best work ever, and I absolutely love it. Ghouls and Ghosts, the actual game of course, is a celebrated port of a Capcom arcade classic, itself a sequel to Ghosts and Goblins, a game notorious for being one of the hardest of all time. The Genesis port, while not quite as hard, lives up to the name, and thanks to top-notch programming by none other than Yuji Naka, it plays buttery smooth. Good enough, in fact, that at the time, it was frequently hailed as being arcade perfect. Now, of course, that's sentimental nonsense, but nonetheless, Ghouls and Ghosts for the Sega Genesis is one hell of an action platformer, and it would turn out to be, eventually, one of my favorite games for the console. Eventually, I say. Because, believe it or not, in 1989, for a 7-year-old, Ghouls and Ghosts was a bit frightening, and it took me some time to warm up to it. But warm up to it I did, and it's one of those games that I have completely memorized, to the point where even today, I can still beat it like a piñata at a Mexican birthday party. Would you look at that? Feliz cumpleaños, Miguel. Espero que tú tienes un año muy especial. Qué bonita. Speaking of special years, that reminds me, the Christmas of 1990 was pretty special too. I'd had my Sega Genesis for a full year now. That back fat was really starting to build up nice and juicy. And I tell you what, I was still holding out for something that could compete with Super Mario Brothers on the NES. A solid, lighthearted platformer full of secrets, challenge, and inventive levels. Up to that point, the Sega Genesis did have Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. Unfortunately, that game kinda sucks. Indeed, it was one of those games you had to hide under your bed before friends came over because, well, it was just sort of embarrassing. Christmas 1990 to the rescue. And the game that Christmas brought to change my fortunes that year was none other than Mickey's Castle of Illusion, a charming side-scrolling platformer starring Mickey Mouse that featured some of the most beautifully drawn level art ever conceived up to that point, and enough Disney-esque magic to fool me into thinking that the House of Mouse had ventured into the video game business. But it didn't. The Castle of Illusion was entirely the creation of Sega and the brainchild of one Emiko Yamamoto, who strove to pay careful homage to Disney design and animation quality by using extensive frames of animation and crafting as much personality and detail as possible in every second of gameplay. The result is a game that plays at a rather sluggish pace, as the Genesis is absolutely pushed to the brink of its blast processing potential, and yet the game design is so creative and careful that it almost doesn't matter that it all seems like a magic mushroom-infused fever dream underwater. I guess this really is a proper alternative to the Super Mario Bros. After all. I've butt-slammed my way through this surprisingly challenging game numerous times. And though I like the Master System version better, it's a completely different game, I still can't help but regard the Castle of Illusion as one of my all-time favorite games for the Sega Genesis. And for a while, it was the Genesis game that I played the most, while the other kids in my neighborhood, well, they played outside. That is until Christmas 1991. That's when St. Nicholas shocked me with, of all things, a SpiderMan game? Holy cow! A SpiderMan game! This was remarkable. For some context, you have to keep in mind that in 1991, Spider-Man was almost exclusively a comic book phenomenon in the eyes of kids my age. This was several years before the famous 1994 animated TV series, about a decade before Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, and yet decades after any of the old Spider-Man TV shows from the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. So this Spider-Man game was really standing on an island all by itself, solely on the reputation and popularity of Marvel comic books. And boy, was Spider-Man for the Genesis ever faithful to the comic books. It featured big, brightly colored sprites that were faithful to the art style of the source material. The characters are accurate. Spider-Man is actually Peter Parker, who works at the Daily Bugle. He's dating Mary Jane, who appropriately enough gets kidnapped, and there's even good old Aunt May. And just like in the comics, Peter Parker is a photographer, and in fact, you have to make money in the game in order to replenish your webbing by photographing Spider-Man's most famous enemies. And there are a lot of them here too. You get Dr. Octopus, the Sandman, Electro, the Lizard, Hobgoblin, the Kingpin is the main villain, and even Venom makes surprise appearances throughout the game. Spider-Man's powers are also well represented. He can stick to walls, crawl on the ceiling, jump super high, and of course he can swing around with his web, shoot a projectile that ties up weak enemies, and even use a web-made shield, which is totally the kind of thing that Spider-Man would do in the 80s comic books. They even represent his Spidey sense going off right before boss fights. Unfortunately, also true to the comics, Spider-Man's web-based powers are actually man-made and extremely finite, and quickly running out of webbing immediately dampens the most appealing aspect of this game. Further, unlike the real Spider-Man, who's strong enough to do stuff like this, the Genesis game Spider-Man is weak, and it takes him lots of punches to bring down even the frumpiest and dumpiest of foes. Look at that, kinda looks like me at 10 years old. Spider-Man also suffers from bogus hit detection, awkward yet oddly realistic level design, extremely unbalanced gameplay, cryptic bull, and erratic boss fight patterns. Making matters worse, the entire game is on a timer, and if you don't finish the entire game quick enough, it's game over. Thus, it's safe to say that Spider-Man for the Sega Genesis is extremely hard, and not in the fun let's try that again sort of way, but more like in the bad give up and go outside and play sort of way. It was a great year, and I lost 12 pounds, and even though it's not really a very good game, somehow Spider-Man vs. Kingpin for the Genesis managed to be the single greatest Spider-Man video game ever made for many years to come. 1992. 1992 was probably the best Christmas ever for most Genesis fans. It saw the release, for instance, of Sonic 2, which was turned into a national event of epic proportions. Sonic Tuesday it was called. Super exciting stuff, full of B-list celebrities. It was a great time for Sonic fans.
I don't understand. Why don't girls like me?
But let me let you in on a little secret. I wasn't really one of them. Not in 1992. No, for me there were bigger considerations that year. Because 1992 was the year the Sega Menacer was released. A light gun for the Sega Genesis. Something that I'd been hoping for since day one. The neighborhood kids all had Duck Hunt on the NES. The Genesis was awesome, but why in the heck couldn't I play Duck Hunt? Or something cooler, like maybe Ninja Hunt? If the Genesis was unequivocally better than the NES, then you really ought to have something better than the NES Zapper, right? But when I opened up the Menacer, Christmas morning in 1992, that's exactly what I thought I had. Something better than the Zapper. I mean, just look how much bigger and cooler it was. It had a scope to aim and everything. It was heavy-duty stuff. And if you didn't like the feel of the rifle configuration, then the Menacer could be reconfigured into a handheld, which I actually preferred most of the time. I can't say that holding this was as satisfying or comfortable as the NES Zapper, but it did at least feel like an actual gun in your hand, as opposed to the Nintendo Super Scope, which always looked like you were just trying to spy on your neighbors. Hey there, Becky. Unfortunately, unlike the NES Zapper or the Sega Phaser, the Menacer was also wireless, meaning it required 6 AAA batteries to be powered up, thus making it quite heavy to play with after a while. On top of that, the Menacer used infrared technology, with a wired receiver that you had to balance on top of your TV set. You also had to calibrate the Menacer every time that you played, but despite this extra step and all this extra stuff, it just wasn't as accurate as older light guns for 8-bit consoles. The trigger was also shallow and unsatisfying to press. In short, the Menacer actually sucked, but at least it came with 6 free games. Totally awesome. Totally awesome, that is, until you actually started playing them. Because wow, it's like Sega barely tried here. I later found out that the Menacer was rushed to market in about 6 months in order to compete with Nintendo's Super Scope. And yup, these games are definitely reflective of that fact. They are shallow, slapdash, and utterly forgettable. I did sort of like the Toe Jam and Earl minigame, however, which just goes to show how far some creative graphics and awesome music can take you. More memorable, however, was my next present from Mr. Santa Claus. The real, and as it would turn out, only reason to get a Sega Menacer, Terminator 2. The arcade game, a fairly impressive home port of Midway's hit game of the same name that had dominated arcades the previous year. Which of course was 1991, a year that may as well have been called the year of the Terminator, since James Cameron's sci-fi masterpiece, Terminator 2, was dropped in theaters that summer like an atomic bomb, crushing the box office and completely rewriting the future of film history, for better and for worse. Consequently, of course, there were toys, comics, t-shirts, and most importantly for us, video games. And this is the Sega Genesis game. And really, for me, this was the first time it actually did feel like the Genesis was really bringing the arcades into the living room. Thanks in part to the wackiness of the Sega Menacer, but also the monumental hype of the Terminator. T2, the arcade game, was definitely the second most hyped Sega game of the year, after Sonic 2. And I guess you can say that 1992 was the year of number 2. Get it? The year of number 2? Well, don't blame me. I stole this joke from James Rolfe. Anyway, thankfully T2 the arcade game was way less disappointing than the Menacer light gun. Indeed, it was only mildly disappointing. Obviously this version of the game did not look or sound the same as the arcade counterpart, but it played pretty much the same, insofar as it was just a repetitive run-of-the-mill gallery shooter, vexed with bullet sponge enemies, and a machine gun that was designed to slow to a crawl after only a few seconds of awesomeness. Obviously, as an arcade game, T2 was mainly designed as a Carnage quarter-stealing con job. So crap like overheating guns, cheap enemies, and constant death was to be expected. If you wanted to see the next thrilling level, you really just needed to dump a few more quarters into the slots and shoot everything you could until you died again after roughly 2 to 3 minutes. But this wasn't T2 the arcade game. This was T2 the arcade game at home. And believe it or not, there just wasn't a way to put quarters in the Sega Genesis, not without totally breaking it. So the answer was to just make the game arbitrarily easy. So that's T2 on the Genesis in a nutshell, an easy, truncated version of a very repetitive short arcade game. And yet, that was the only reason to own a Sega Menacer, the worst light gun of the early 90s. So then, did Christmas 92 suck? No, not really, because I was only 10 years old. And so this would have been totally awesome at the time. I mean, it's a light gun game about the Terminator. That's like one step down from getting rocket boots. Though I must admit, the thrill was short-lived, and after a few weeks, I didn't touch either the Terminator or the Menacer again for pretty much the rest of my life. I'll be back. Nah, sorry dude, this is it. I'm finished. 1993. For Genesis kids, the Christmas of 1993 was dominated by two games. Disney's Aladdin, a way overhyped action platformer by Virgin that featured spectacular sprite animation and mediocre game design. And then there was Street Fighter II Champion Edition, a game so momentous that Sega had to release it alongside a brand new 6-button controller, the new gold standard for Sega gamers everywhere. So, being like 11 years old, you can imagine which game I was more excited about. Sure, Santa brought me both, and Aladdin was super fashionable at the time, like a lady's cardigan, but I was mostly pumped to finally play Street Fighter II on the Sega Genesis. Street Fighter II was one of the biggest games in the world in 1991, and thus it was an absolutely monumental victory for Nintendo when their Super Nintendo released an exclusive port in 1992. To say I was jealous was an understatement. No, I was filled with bitter rage, like Akuma. But then I found out that the Sega Genesis was not only getting their own port, but that it was going to be the superior Champion Edition. I wasn't just relieved, I was ready to declare the console wars over and Sega the definitive victor. But then I found out that Nintendo was getting an even more betterer, Street Fighter II Turbo. And then I was back on fire all over again. But honestly, getting Street Fighter II Champion Edition for Genesis on Christmas 1993 is one of my all-time great kid memories. Partly because I absolutely loved the game and loved practicing all the moves of all my favorite characters, like Guile, Ryu, and even Vega. But also because I ate some bad ham and got wicked food poisoning that made me Hadouken all over the place for like 24 hours straight. I couldn't eat ham for years after that. So was Street Fighter II Champion Edition worth the wait, plus the requirement of a new controller with enough buttons? Absolutely. It's a good port, and one of my all-time favorite Genesis games. Arcade perfect? No, not even close. But it was good enough, and now I could play Street Fighter II at home while I recovered from the scourge of ham. 1994. Christmas 1994, things were starting to change. Things were happening to my body. I'd grown like a foot in just a few weeks, and my baby back fat had started to morph into a flannel shirt, Doc Martens, torn up jeans, and tribal tattoos. I was like getting edgier, dude, and I wasn't even sure if Santa Claus was really real or just an arbitrary social construct erected by the military-industrial complex in order to propagate consumerism directly benefiting evil multinational corporations, dude. But just in case, the game I asked Santa for in 1994 was Maximum Carnage, a SpiderMan game by Software Creations that combined beat-em-up game mechanics with my favorite comic book superhero, Venom! Oh, and SpiderMan was in there too. He's also pretty cool, but seriously, it was a beat-em-up where you could play as freaking Venom. In 1994, that was the coolest thing ever, even cooler than rocket boots. In the early 90s, Marvel Comics had become extremely popular, and alongside Wolverine and the rest of the X-Men, Spider-Man and Venom had emerged at the top of the heap. One of the great highlights of this time period was a 14-part story arc called Maximum Carnage, which involved mortal enemies, Spider-Man and Venom, having to team up to defeat Carnage, a serial killer endowed with symbiotic superpowers and a personality even crazier than Venom's. And that's a guy that goes around talking to himself and eating people. Maximum Carnage is one of the most popular Spider-Man story arcs ever printed, and its effects resonated into toys, which were great by the way, animation, and yes, video games. I'm starting to notice a theme for this video. Anyway, today Maximum Carnage is remembered as a goofy mid-tier Sega Genesis game, produced by companies forgotten by time. But in 1994, Maximum Carnage was legitimately one of the year's biggest games. It featured authentic comic book art, some pretty cool animation, and a legitimately rockin' soundtrack by the band Green Jelly, which was a weirdly wonderful choice even back then. In fact, if I'm being honest, the music was the best reason to enjoy this game, which sadly suffers from a high level of repetitiveness, and it forces you to beat up women. A lot for some reason. But worst of all, and this is practically unforgivable, it totally lacks two-player support. What's up with that? A beat-em-up game without two-player co-op? That's like an RPG without a story, a platforming game without a jump button, Christmas without fake snow. Sorry, it's the best I can do. I live in Southeast Texas. Natural snow isn't typically a thing around here. And when it is, well, it's a national embarrassment. Still, in 1994, if you got Maximum Carnage for Christmas, you were probably stoked. And little did you know, but this was probably your last hurrah as a Sega Genesis owner. Because 1995 was just around the corner, and that was the year of the Sega Saturn, meaning that the production of Genesis games would drop precipitously. Sure, some big titles like X-Men Clone Wars and the incredible Phantasy Star 4 were still coming out, but not with the same level of importance. And indeed, most of us were ready to move on. I mean, so was Sega. They even started putting all their new games in red cardboard boxes, almost as if to discourage new sales.
Oh, what's that? You want a Genesis game? What are you, a loser? You should get a Saturn, you dummy. But if you insist, then here. In exchange for $50, we have now put the game in the same packaging as a freaking Reese's Peanut Butter Cup.
Is it any wonder that I got a Sony PlayStation? Oh well, anyway, by 1995, I wasn't really getting Christmas presents much anymore anyway. Like a real man, all my presents had been switched over to stuff I needed, like boxers, socks, Gillette shaving products, and collectible swords and knives. Seriously, I owned a Claymore. A freaking Claymore. My parents let me own a Claymore.
Sick, dude.
Anyway, thus ends my fond recollection of the Sega Genesis Christmases past. Nothing quite beats the excitement of getting the console that first year in 1989, but Street Fighter II is definitely second place, and in third was the Menacer with Terminator 2. All pretty good memories, except for the ham. We at Creative Cat Productions hope that you and your family have a very Merry Christmas. And to all we say, good night. Thank you all very much for watching. Ho ho ho. Bye bye now.